Hello, UK Crime Book Club. Apologies for the delay. We're having all kinds of technical difficulties. Marvellous fun. But we have the lovely Stuart Gibbon. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Sam. How everybody? Evening.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Are you?
Good, thanks.
And I've been doing some writing and quite a lot of work, loads and loads of work. Since lockdown, things have gone a bit mad, and I guess writers are, using the time where they can, if they can concentrate, which isn't always easy, to do a bit of questioning and research and that sort of thing. So it's been really, really busy. But I'd much rather be like that than quiet. So long may it continue.
Of course, yeah. We have a few. Well, we've got quite a lot of questions, so we'll dive straight in with one from Caroline Maston, one of our lovely admins. What is the most common question you get asked by authors? There must be loads.
Yeah, there are. I guess there's probably two different areas that are the most popular, if you like. And the question is sometimes phrased for the last few weeks and probably longer, actually. It's been about missing people. So I get asked an awful lot, who's in charge, what sort of things they do, what sort of inquiries they can carry out, trying to bust some of the myths about, do you have to wait 24 hours before you report someone missing, all those sort of things. So I think it's probably because a lot of the authors I work with write psychological thrillers, and they often involve a missing person. So it might be someone that goes missing and then unfortunately turns up dead and it becomes a murder, or maybe just somebody that goes missing and it then becomes a story about why they've gone missing and whether they're found in the end. So missing persons, I would say, is a hugely hot topic at the moment, and also, of course, murder. How does a murder work is sometimes a question which is quite a big answer to give. Who's in charge? What sort of things do they do? What does the boss do? Because we've seen it on telly, and we see him doing everything or her doing everything. Is that right? And just a bit of realism around how challenging it can be to try and solve a murder case. So I'd say missing people and murders are probably the most, and a little bit of kidnapping thrown in. We like a bit of kidnapping, don't we? A lot of thriller writers will ask about kidnapping, which is quite a difficult one to give an answer to, because a lot of the way the police deal with kidnappings and hostages is very sensitive. Obviously, their tactics are sensitive too. So you just have to sort of generic advice around some of the things that the police would be considering if somebody's been taken hostage. But again, for some reason, kidnapping, I guess because it's a good read, if it's an ongoing situation, it gets the reader
adds a level of mystery
gripped with the book. Is this person going to be found in time? Are they going to be murdered? Or are they going to turn up safe and well? So split. If I give you three: missing people, murder, and a bit of kidnap thrown in, are probably three of the most popular areas I get asked about.
Funnily enough, I've actually got, now I'm like a weather girl, I don't know which way to point. So The Missing by C.L. Taylor, which is one of the ones that you advised on. So
yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. And that was, there was quite a lot of chat with C.L. Taylor about, as you say, about the how it works, and actually sometimes the author just wants to know for themselves how it would work in reality, and they won't necessarily write it like that. As long as they can get in the head what it's about, then they can write it how they want to, without necessarily making an odd error here and there around the procedure. But I think some people, and I say that it's not always about, can you tell me how to do it and that's how I'm going to write it. It's, can you tell me how it happens? Then I'm going to fit it around that, just in case I put something in that might be, a little bit unrealistic, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's huge fun being able to, to communicate with different writers.
Obviously, you when you left the police force, you were a DCI. You were in the police for a long time. How long were you in the police for?
In total, it was probably about just over 30 years, about 32 years. I started very young. I was actually 16 when I started, and I couldn't join the regulars then because I was too young. So I joined the police cadets, which was kind of like an apprenticeship, really. It was very disciplined, bit like the army cadets, I guess, in a way. That's sort of thing. Lots of marching and lots of classroom work, lots of practicals and scenarios, and of course learning the law as well. So that was a good platform, if you like, for me to then be able to apply for the regulars, which I did, and I became a regular PC constable when I was 18. And then I worked in London for just under 20 years. Most of that was in uniform initially, but then I started to do another kind of apprenticeship to become a detective, which was actually really quite hard. Lots of different things that you have to do, learning the law and putting into practice and working with an experienced detective to show that you can do the job properly. And then eventually I became a detective. And then I moved to another part of the country, to the East Midlands, where I carried on from there. I was lucky enough for periods to be able to stay in the CID, whereas sometimes you go backwards and forwards when you're promoted. I did that initially as a sergeant, but when I became an inspector, I became a detective inspector kind of straight away, and then stayed there to become a DCI, which was good because it was where my skill set was strongest, if you like, and it made sense for me to stay within CID to do that work. So probably just over about 32 years in total, but really all of my kind of adult life until I finished, because as I say, I was at school. I was brought up in the northeast of England, and I may well have stayed there because I tried to get into the police in Northumbria, but unfortunately they weren't recruiting at that time, and I tried various other forces, and London was almost kind of like not a last resort, but it was just I'll write a letter to the Met as well, because it's a big force and the chances of me getting in there are pretty slim. And then of course the only reply I got back of a positive nature was from London, and it was, can you come down and do the various selection process? So as I say, as a 16-year-old, pretty naive and learning things very quickly. I just wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed up north, whether my career path would have been similar. You never know, do you? But these things are kind of mapped out, I think. But no regrets. Really, really enjoyed it. Never done a proper job before, as people tell me. Just a police all the way through until I finished, of course. And now I'm using the brain and whatever to hopefully try and help people to write good books.
I've just had one of the admins is teasing me. I think she's enjoying herself. Thanks, Will Templeton. That's really helpful. I check my messages from time to time because Caroline Maston helps me out with the technical side, and he's just sent me a picture of me beaming from ear to ear. They know how excited I've been to talk to you. So now I'm being teased, which is delightful. Let's go back to when you decided that you were going to leave. What prompted that decision? And then obviously consultants and natural follow on, but what prompted the change?
There was probably two things, I think. Firstly, because it was all I'd ever done, really, and I was thinking I'd done lots and lots of time in the police. Maybe it was time to try something just a little bit different. But also, the role that I was doing at that time was as a murder detective. So I was in charge of quite a lot of people, and it's quite a stressful job. And actually, when I began the job, it was different to when I ended it. So basically the goalposts changed while I was doing the job, and it became a much bigger kind of animal. It became a regional job rather than just a local job, which meant that I was actually whizzing around all over the East Midlands, a huge, great area with 5 big police forces, all very busy. And it takes its toll after a while, especially dealing with serious cases time after time. And I guess it was approaching the time when I'd reached 30 years in the police, which is a time where you make a decision. Do you carry on, which of course you can do if you want to, or do you decide to leave then? And although I was enjoying it, it was certainly having an impact on my my health, if you like. I was getting run down. I was picking up bugs and colds, feeling very tired a lot of the time. And I think you just get to a point, having made so many big decisions around cases that I was involved in, where I thought it's about time I gave this a bit of a rest. And I don't think it's something you can step back from and then come back into and just pick it up like riding a bike. It's not like that. It's one of those when you move out of it, things move so quickly that before you know it, you've lost a little bit of train of thought. So it was just really that change of job description became a much bigger role. I carried on for a while, but could tell that actually, it was time to do something different. And again, looking back, no regrets at all, because it's opened up many other doors that I probably wouldn't have had I carried on. And who knows, I may have still been doing it now. You never know. But it was just really a combination of factors that made me think this is an opportunity to do something slightly different, really.
Yeah, well, so in one of your books, you do mention that people leave, they drop jobs as they maybe retire as a detective, but then they do go back in some other capacity. What kind of jobs do people do if they go back into the police force?
It's quite surprising, really, how many police officers do go back in again when they finish. And what is quite funny in a way is that some of these officers are the ones who say, I'm never doing this job again. I can't wait to retire and get away from this organisation. And then, a couple of weeks later when they're finished, you see them back sort of, there's all sorts of things, really. I mean, there's been people who have finished at a reasonably high rank, who have then gone back and been a police community support officer.
Okay.
So, out on patrol.
Quite a change.
Very much so, a massive change, yeah, definitely. Others who have gone and worked behind the front counter at the police station. So when people go in to make their inquiries or to report something, they're the people that they'll first deal with. So they're not police officers as such, but they're civilians, but they're members of police staff. I've had other colleagues that I used to work with who've gone into specialist roles. So there is a chap that I used to work with who was a detective sergeant, and he was very good at dealing with paperwork and exhibits and things like that. He was one of the best, really, while he was a police officer. And he was a DS, and he retired. And I think he had a short break, but then he came back into the same force, and he became a civilian exhibits officer. So he was still working on murders, but he wasn't a police officer. He was a civilian member of police staff, doing a very similar job, but just not as a ranked police officer. All sorts of other jobs within the organisation, maybe managing sex offenders and violent offenders, where you go out and visit them and you make sure that they're abiding by their licence rules. So many, many different roles. But the best one I've had, who was someone that I joined with, who didn't come back to the police, but he's now a vicar. And I think that's like the best one, really. I don't think I can top that one because it's just fantastic. And he is the last person in the world that I would ever have thought would become a vicar as well. We shall say no more about that one.
You've mentioned quite a few different things that people have done. They've gone on to be gardeners and, different things in the book. But yeah, vicar does seem quite removed.
It shocked me quite a bit, and I didn't see it coming, I must admit. Because I've known this chap, I've known him for probably best part of 40 years now, believe it or not. I was in the police cadets with him. When I moved away from London, he stayed in London. But then a few years later, I was at the police station dealing with something, and I saw this familiar face, and I couldn't forget the face because he's got a big beam on his face, and he was kind of pulling faces at me. And it's this chap from way back in London. And then we continued to kind of stay in touch in the county I was working in. Unfortunately, he had quite a nasty motorcycle accident and he hurt his leg. So he had to leave the police on a medical retirement. But now he's a vicar. I must call in and see him because he's actually in a village that's not a million miles away from me. So I think I'll repay him and just turn up on his doorstep one day and see what he's got to say for himself.
Sounds like a nice surprise for him.
It sounds like something we could put in a book, actually. It's so, it's so different. Yeah.
So you co-author with Stephen Wade, who's a crime historian. How did that come about? How did you meet Stephen and decide that this is what you're going to do? Because it works so well. I mean, I gave you my 5-star review. I would have given more stars if I could have done. So it works so well, past and present together. How did that come about?
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much for the review. As I say, they mean a lot to us because, you know, we've got a single person publisher and we haven't got a big team behind us. There's literally kind of maybe 3 or 4 of us. There's obviously lots of lovely authors out there who support us and promote our books for us as well. But it's important to have those reviews because it does make a big difference. So thanks very much for that. I think you're right. I think it does work because some people like the historical side and some people like the contemporary and others like a bit of a mix of the both. So I think you're right. It does seem to work. And how we met was, it was literally quite straightforward. I got a message from a lady in Lincolnshire who was running a literature festival, and she was setting up I don't know what are a group of crime writers called. Good question. You can let me know.
A murder? Maybe we're like crows. Maybe we're a murder.
Could be anything.
I don't know. Answers on a postcard. UK Crime Book Club members.
This lady, Sarah, she was setting up a panel of crime writers from the area, the East Midlands, and she managed to identify 3 people who were local. And she contacted me and said she knew me from previous. Would you be prepared, you know, to chair the panel? So I did, and it was great fun. And we did it with the audience and loads of questions, and it was really fabulous. And afterwards, we were having a coffee, all 4 of us. One of them, of course, was Stephen Wade, and I hit it off with all of them, and I still, you know, think very highly of them all to this day. And this was only about 5 years ago now, I suppose. We just had a chat, and we kind of said it almost in jest, you know. Steve has written 70, 80 books. I lose count of how many books he's written, but he's well established as a historical crime writer. And I, of course, hadn't done anything like that. And I think the conversation just went something along the lines of, you know, shall we think about maybe writing a book together? I think Steve suggested it first because it's something I probably would never have thought of. And I said, yeah, okay. Well, when we chatted about it, we had a few meetings, and eventually the Crime Writers Casebook came from it. We talk about the really historical, because there's some fascinating stuff in there, and I'll try to start from where I started in the police and bring it up to date and just put things in, because we knew, and we really didn't think at that time that there was too much out there of that sort of thing that could help crime writers, but also actually might be a good read for just people who are interested in true crime and crime fiction as a reader. And that's how it sort of first came about. So I met him at a festival. We put it together, published it, and we were really quite shocked and delighted that it did so well and continues to do so well. So of course, then the conversation came down the line from the publisher in particular. You know, are you going to do another one? Are you going to write another book? And we had to think about how different we could make it. And that's where Being a Detective came in, which came out March 2019. And it is different. There is a little bit of an overlap, but actually there's a lot in the detective book that there isn't in the case book, because it's about the role of a detective, going way back to 1840 when detectives were first formed, talking about how Scotland Yard had all the detectives and they used to go whizzing out across the country to solve people's crimes for them with a trilby hat on and all that sort of thing, up to now, you know, what it looks like now, what detectives do now, what sort of things they deal with. And there's a few bits in there about modern crime, so cyber crime, something called keyless car crime, where you may well have seen it on TV, where criminals can cars because they haven't got a key, but they've got a fob that opens the car up, and it's a push button start. So in certain circumstances, they could potentially come to your house in the middle of the night, and by using certain electronics. So things like that, just really up to date. Telephone scams, bank scams. So Steve covers the historical, and I do the contemporary. And again, it's been quite well received because I think it gives writers ideas for plots and storylines. And obviously, for those who are interested in crime anyway as a genre, it's quite an interesting read. Certainly, that's the feedback we're getting. So it seems to be a combination that's worked. We're very different people, but when we do events and festivals prior to lockdown, people seem to enjoy Steve's input from, you know, the cases that he's examined through the archives, to my personal experiences of dealing with cases as a police officer.
And you do cover some well-known cases in the books. Was it hard to know what to put in there and to do it in such a sensitive way as you did? Was that quite difficult to do?
Very. That was probably one of the biggest challenges for me, certainly, because the cases that I've covered are either very high profile and awful cases, or they're my
Yeah.
personal experiences, which is the same for me, because the impact that these cases have on the victims and their families is awful. So it's difficult, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't want to put too much in. Hopefully I haven't. Too many cases, too much personal experience. I mean, it's fine talking about the impact it has on me and how my job at that time was quite difficult and traumatic. But when you're revisiting awful events in the past of people who have lost loved ones, and that's not good, and it's not something that I would want to do. So it is quite difficult, and I try to limit it as best I can, and I'm using them really just for context. I know that sounds a bit bland, but that is true. It's so that if I'm talking about DNA or Locard's principle about how every contact leaves a trace, I'm just trying to give those examples from real life, if you like, that demonstrate how these cases may have been solved, or some part of the evidence that's been used to put my point of view in the book into context. But you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to find that. I wouldn't want it to be a book just full of case studies, particularly murder cases and serious crime cases, because I've witnessed firsthand the impact that can have on loved ones, and it's something clearly that you never get over. I wouldn't want to be bringing that back up time and again for the sake of something in a book, and hopefully that comes across, really, because it's something that I think I care quite deeply about. That the first and foremost when dealing with any case is the victim. Obviously, murder cases, you want to do your best and you want to get justice for the bereaved family, and that's always the focal point. And sometimes that is obviously far more important, all the time, I would say, probably, than actually the evidence or the media or anything like that, really.
Yeah. And the media, I mean, I would say that all of the cases that you've written about, because they were so well known, people can draw from their own memory and they don't need every detail from you. And yeah, that was managed beautifully. But the media must be, when tabloids, for example, are putting out different stories, and that what they're doing it's not true, not necessarily ethical. So how does that interfere with an investigation? Does it cause as many problems as I'd imagine it does?
It can do, very much so. I was probably quite fortunate in a lot of the cases I dealt with, because they were at a time when the media was quite challenging, but social media wasn't quite as it is now.
Yeah.
Having said that, I did have cases. I remember one case in particular, which was a really challenging murder case, which was a hate crime. The gentleman who had been murdered was Polish. There was a lot of tension in the community, and it was a really challenging case to manage and to solve. And we did solve it as a team, and I was kind of in charge of that. But the reason I mentioned that case in particular is because I even remember now distinctly, I could put myself back there. I actually had to do a press conference to the media, to put out a message that the information was being put through the media, but also mainly through social media, that was just completely incorrect, and it was which was obviously causing us issues in the investigation. And a lot of the information that was put on, in fact, the vast majority was false. And I think you know what it's like.
Yeah.
Somebody puts some information on a social media channel, and then somebody might add a little bit to it, and before you know it, it starts as one thing and it ends up with something completely different that sometimes bears no relation to either the thing that started out or the truth. So it can be quite challenging. And I remember that particular case, there was stuff going on about the case itself that was just causing more and more problems, and it really did hinder our investigation, because when we were going out to talk to potential witnesses, we weren't getting their cooperation, because they didn't trust us because of what was being said and written and typed on social media. And I think with the media in general, with the tabloid media, newspapers, TV, that sort of thing, it can have a massive, massive impact on your investigation at whatever stage it's at. I mean, we just have to look at cases like Christopher Jeffries was the man
with
who was
Joanne.
vilified by the press on murdering a young lady, and he hadn't murdered her, and then eventually they found the person who had. But actually, the newspapers went to town on that individual and printed things they really shouldn't. And in the end, they were kind of, I think they were sued for it, and they had to pay damages. But that man's reputation was completely shattered by the time that was finished. So it just shows you, by articles in the newspaper that people read, may or may not believe, you know, if you print something like that, then it's too late then to recover the situation. And so it can have an impact on an investigation in many, many different ways. The case of Rachel Nickell at Wimbledon Common, slightly different, but again, you remember that Colin Stagg, and there were some police kind of like a sting operation, honey trap operation that went on in relation to that. That didn't end well, and down the line, it was proved that Colin Stagg actually hadn't murdered Rachel Nickell, somebody else had. But there was lots of kind of challenging and relatively negative publicity. So I think the reporting needs to be responsible, but never before have we lived in a world like now where if something happens, you could control it from a policing aspect to a certain extent. But nowadays, you're likely to find the first time you know about something as a police officer may be when it's on social media because somebody's filmed it. So that's another completely different challenge where media comes into it. Somebody films it, then it goes on to a news channel, maybe on TV or into the newspapers. And before you know it, it's all the way across the world. And for investigators, that's really difficult because you've got to identify all that footage, which is often very important, and try and gather it and try and use it as evidence, whilst at the same time trying to limit any damage that might be done to the investigation. So it's a real sensitive and difficult area, and one that's far more difficult to handle now, in light that everybody seems to have obviously a smartphone and, you know, those sort of types of devices. That, just to give you an idea how old I am, if you don't already know, when I joined the police back in the 1980s, not as Steve was saying, the 1880s, the mobile phone, and I think it was a few years before I actually got a pager at work, and I had a pager on, used to wear it on my trouser belt to go off if I got a call, you know. So there weren't any phones. Computers were the big old-fashioned, great big slow things. In fact,
so when it comes to hindrances, do any of the criminals ever manage to practically hand themselves in by making silly mistakes? I was asking you about, have any criminals ever practically handed themselves to you on a plate with silly errors that they've made?
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, Stan, but anybody that's read the Crime Writers Casebook will be familiar, probably maybe with a bit at the beginning where I talk about my career and a particular arrest that I was lucky enough to make when I was based at Wembley. I first started out in the police. I'd only been there a few weeks and I was in uniform. And it was literally, I'd gone out to basically keep a quiet walk around the block, really. And what happened was I took my hat off and I was walking around a quiet residential streets not far from the police station when I heard sound of breaking glass, and I looked through a little gap in the hedge and I could see these two big burly chaps there, and they were obviously coming out the back of somebody's house. And as they came to the end of the footpath, they looked in my direction, obviously saw me in full uniform, and I shouted the usual, "Oi, please stop," or words to that effect. And actually, they were quite big chaps. So in a way, I'm quite pleased they ran away from me rather than towards me, because that would have been some wrestling match between the three of us, I'm sure. Now, at that time, I was quite fit and quite quick. So I gave chase, running after them, and got on the radio to tell the station what was happening. Now, I can only assume that these two characters, who were actually seasoned burglars with a long criminal record, both of them, I can only assume that casing the joint, as it's called, wasn't one of their fortes, because what actually happened was, and if you can imagine, it's like a scene from the Keystone Cops, really, 1980 version, 1982 version. I'm running behind them, chasing them, shouting for them to stop, and they go up the road to like a T-junction, and they turn left, and then they carry on running, which is about another 100, 200 yards. Now, what I knew at that point, which they didn't clearly know, was that at the end of the road they were running down, right in front of them on the opposite side, was quite a large building with a blue light outside, which is the Nick police station. And they just carried on running. So, of course, I'm shouting and screaming in my radio, saying, "Can someone come out, please, and help me out here?" And, of course, then I look up, and it's like the charge of the Light Brigade, because all these people are, well, all of them, I say it seemed like a lot at the time, running out across the road and grabbed hold of these two fellas. And that was one of my greatest arrests, because later on in the canteen, and then certainly in the pub a few days later, I was telling people how, well, you've got to keep an eye on the crime rate, and there were obviously burglaries at that time of night, and you've got to go out and have a walk round. And didn't really admit or confess that I'd just gone out because I wanted to get, keep my head down if possible and make sure I got off on time. It served me right, because I didn't finish at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't get off on time anyway. But that was one of those where, it was very rare in those days for you to catch, and it still is, unfortunately, catch burglars in the act, as it were. So it was a real good quality crime arrests, which went down well in the CID. And you never know, it might have stood me in good stead later in my career. So that was certainly one episode that I won't forget, and never have done. And another one was probably,
definitely made me laugh when I read about it.
Yeah, you can just picture it, can't you? It was just, I was just so relieved that because they were big chaps. I mean, they were massive, and I was just glad they didn't turn around and come towards me, because I'd obviously have done my best, but I'd have probably ended up with a cartoon character just flat on the road as they carried on running down the road. But the other one was a series of burglaries, quite nasty burglaries in terms of not necessarily the violence used, but they were targeting older people. They were called distraction burglaries. And these people that were doing them were very forensically aware. So it was very rare for them to leave forensic evidence. They would either wear gloves, or they would pull their sleeves of their jumpers over their hands, and not touch certain items. So we were absolutely amazed when we went to the scene of one of them to find out that one of the suspects had asked the lady in the house if he could have a drink of water. So when we obviously investigated that and found out that she'd actually just put the cup in the sink to wash it, but hadn't got round to physically washing it. So it was sat in some water, but not completely submerged. We obviously managed to take possession of that mug, took it away, and you guessed it, there was DNA on the cup belonging to one of the well-known distraction burglars. So all that preparation around, let's not touch anything, for some reason, I don't know whether they didn't think it was possible at that time to get DNA, but of course it does from saliva. That was one of the many successes we had as DNA was developing through the 80s and the 90s. Have a drink of water, left something on the mug. We've also had DNA recovered in burglary cases from a doorbell, where the suspects rung the doorbell, and then thought about covering their hands up afterwards. And we had a really interesting one where somebody left DNA on a window from their ear, where they'd been listening in to see if they could hear anybody inside, and it left a nice little mark on the window, which was swabbed, and we managed to get DNA from that. So one or two kind of crazy, if you like, results from people who have done things that you probably wouldn't expect them to do, and made some fairly basic errors when it comes to being a criminal, if you like.
Yeah, the ear one surprises me, because I remember seeing that in a TV show, possibly a CSI, one of the American ones, and I remember thinking that's a bit far-fetched, but obviously not.
No, not at all. No, you'd be surprised. I think sometimes you've got to think outside the box as well.
We've got quite a few questions on the stream here. I've been monopolising you with mine and a couple of Kaz's, but we're almost at 10 to 8 already, so we're flying through. Alex Hawley, one of our admins, hi Alex, wants to know, how's the consultancy going and who are you working with, if you can tell us?
Hi Alex. It's going very well, thank you. Very well. Quite a few authors, but a lot of them at the moment are in stages where they're still preparing their storylines. So I will be announcing something fairly soon in terms of some of the people I've been working with. But I've had a couple recently who are pretty well known in terms of psychological thrillers. I've not worked with them before, so we're just kind of developing the way we're going to work at the minute. But as I said to you earlier, Sam, since lockdown in particular, it's been really busy, which is great. I would rather be busy than quiet. And I think people have just taken the opportunity to sit down when they can and write, and it's been absolutely fantastic. But lots of one or two new writers and one or two who have obviously come back to, but hopefully then in the future we'll be seeing some, I'm sure, some absolutely cracking books being released, and I look forward to reading them.
I look forward to seeing your input in them as well, but I'll certainly be having a look at them. Right, Caroline Maston has asked a question that you must get asked a lot, and I doubt you'd give us the answer even if you knew it, but do you think it's possible to commit the perfect crime? Nothing like being put on the spot by our admins.
It depends what you mean by the perfect crime. If you mean a crime that you can get away with, then definitely yes, without question. If you've got a reasonable knowledge of forensics, for example, which is one of the biggest areas for solving crimes, especially these days with the advances, not just in DNA, but in other type forensic evidence. If you're very digitally aware, that's not easy to say at this time of night either. So you know about how mobile phones work, how the internet works, how social media works. I think it is possible, absolutely, that you could commit a crime and leave very little trace of evidence, or the evidence that you do leave may point not to you, possibly to someone else, but maybe not point to you. Of course, every time you use a phone, I had cases before, Googled, how do I murder somebody? And it's been as straightforward as that. And then they've deleted it and thought that it was gone. But of course, it's there kind of forever.
Thank goodness it wasn't gone.
The police have people who can find those sort of things. So to delete your search history, delete the search you've just done, it kind of doesn't work, because once you've made those keystrokes, there's something there that 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, trained investigators will be able to find. So in answer to Caroline, yes, I think it is possible. It's not easy. It's possible. It's becoming more and more difficult. But I would say it probably is possible if you've got the right knowledge, skills, and awareness. You could probably either get away with it because you can't find any evidence to link you to it, or even more worrying, point the blame in someone else's direction.
Well, while our authors who have their many, many searches pick themselves up off the floor in a blind panic, we'll go on to the next question that stays, another one from Kaz, are there a lot of regional differences in policing? Now, we know from country to country there's different differences, but how about from county to county?
Yeah, the police is famous, and always has been, for kind of reinventing the wheel. So something that happened like 10 years ago will go around full circle. They'll try various different options and then end up back where they were 10 years ago, not through technology and things, but the way they do things. So yeah, very much so. There are different terms that the police will use. So, for example, the murder team in the East Midlands is called the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, which is the unit that I used to work with. But in London, it's called something completely different. In Yorkshire, various other counties. So yeah, there are big differences. And police nowadays tend to work regionally as well. So the traffic department, maybe their armed response.
I'm going to.
There are big differences between.
Yeah. So you're going to talk about the differences between the different police forces, and you started to talk about different names that people have.
Yeah, it's just the setups really and everything. The names.
I believe we have lost Stuart again. He's been having some internet difficulties tonight trying to sign in. So